morning, everyone. Thanks for taking some time to sit down. I guess this morning, the presentation I'm doing this morning comes from a conversation that Sid and I had about basically the forum coming up. And as an end user, we talked about, well, you know, he asked me, what have you been doing in the last little while? It might be of interest to people. And he talked to me about renewable energy projects and things like that going on. And I said, well, yeah, actually, we've been through one of those, which was an interesting discussion. And it was great in the forum this morning just to listen to some of the people talk. Steve talked about how, you know, there's opportunities where, as we look at new solar sources and new sources of power like solar, some of the implications of what that means to a team. And so I think that's really sort of the background of what happened to us. And I guess this whole thing reminds me of basically, you know, you go to buy a new car and basically you wonder, you know, what kind of things should I be asking? And at the end of the discussion, you find out this car will do all these wonderful things, but you never asked about whether it actually comes with a spare tire or not, right? And I don't know how many adventures we've been on like that, but this one's a bit like that. So I'm going to give you some background on sort of the project, and then I'm going to go through what I've called my project memoirs, which will just give you perspective of maybe a little bit about Mark learned on the project. So who's EPCOR to start with? We're a utility company with operations in Western Canada, basically based out of Edmonton, but we also have regional sites that we support out of the Edmonton area, which provide their own unique opportunities for learning when it comes to supporting. We're also doing some work in Ontario now. Our cybersecurity office, basically from the OT side, actually is going to be monitoring the Ontario SCADA systems that we have out there. EPCOR also is in Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, a different division, a different group working on that. But with that, I'm part of the water utility. There is an electricity side, so there's water and power. I'm on the water side, basically, as I said, based out of Edmonton. So with that, I'm going to talk today about the A.L. Smith water treatment plant, basically the addition to it of a solar farm and a battery storage project. And of course, this comes back to looking at you know, what are different companies looking at when it comes to energy efficiency and sustainability, right? What are we going to do? And so E.L. Smith is one of two plants serving the Edmonton area, basically a population of about 1.5 million. We also have pipelines that go out of Edmonton out to many of the rural sites, actually some of them quite extensively further out than you would typically expect. So what was implemented was basically it's 30,350 solar panels. So if you look at that, what looks like sort of a gray area at the background, that's not a lake, okay, unless you want to call it a solar panel lake, that's what it is. Basically a bunch of solar panels that have been put in place. And again, as you put your presentations, I don't know what different organizations, but as I put my presentation through basically looking at corporate communications, there were some greenhouse gas reduction numbers that I had, which I can't share with anyone. Anyway, it's a good news story. The exact number is yet to be determined, I was told, so I can't share it with you. But good news story about greenhouse gas reduction in it. And just to give you a sense of how big is the plant, it's actually it provides about half the power that the A.L. Smith power plant would require. And how big is the plant? Well, up to 400 megaliters a day, which if you divide that by 4, you're going to get to gallons, which might be a little more familiar for some of you folks. So if you look at the title, I was going to get, maybe if I had t-shirts to give away, I was going to see who could pronounce the name of this actual solar farm, okay? But then I thought maybe I'm not quite pronouncing it right either. So, basically it's Kisakau Pisum Solar Farm, and it's basically Cree for daylight sun. And of course, one of the things as you're looking at establishing renewable energy in these different locations is basically working with the people that were part of the land that were there before you, right? And so a lot of work EPCOR's actually had to do in actually releasing this. Of course, this is part of the River Valley, and as in most cities, River Valley is a very special place where people like to congregate and do things. So if you're going to turn around and take an acre or two of land and put basically solar panels on it, there's going to be a lot of discussion around how to do that right and what that looks like. And so that was part of our journey and part of the discussion here. So moving on to talk at a high level. And so basically, you know, my team is responsible for basically the cybersecurity and basically the monitoring, as well as the implementation design. So I have HMI design people. I've also always had what I call SIS people, and we'll talk a little bit more about it, but that's not safety instrumented systems. That's basically what I call SCADA information systems people. And so basically I've always had people on my team that have IT backgrounds, right? We call them, they're not IT folks, but they're the folks that do the networking and do the firewalls and do all that stuff. We don't do that, leave that to IT, we leave it in-house. And so on my team I have people, and always have had people that do those kind of items and maintain that system. We're completely separate from basically the IT systems, okay? And every year we prove that by unplugging and disconnecting between ourselves and and corporate, and saying, yes, we can actually run without being connected to corporate. The plant will still produce water. This plant will produce water. Our wastewater plant will still continue to treat wastewater without being connected to IT corporate. So as a part of that, that's interesting because it brings you into this journey of discussion of saying, so are we building a solar project, okay? So the solar project is going to actually connect to us, okay, and it's going to provide water for E.L. Smith, and that's a great project. But how do you deal with a project like that? So it's a much different project than we'd had in the past. Like typically, I mean, if we're putting in new filters, a new control system in the plant, something that's going to be impacting our process, we're all over that. We've got standards around how to do that. We've got core competencies. We know exactly what needs to be done. We know what our cybersecurity team is going to do. We know how we're going to monitor it, what software we're going to have running, et cetera, et cetera. But if we're doing it on the outside like this, all of a sudden we're being told by the organization, well, no, this is a plant that just sort of runs out there and it's just going to provide power, right? You know, that's basically what's going to happen. And so from that perspective, it's like we talked about and heard in the main session this morning. There's that sort of sense of what are some of the core competencies that my team, like we're great at, you know, we go through and do control narratives when it comes to process plant, and we stamp those, and we have, you know, under professional guidance and all those kind of things, we have that responsibility. But when it comes to a solar farm, what do we really know about solar farm? What do we know about actually the control strategies that are required for that and those kind of things? Plus, we have a 6 megawatt battery storage. So we're not just providing power during the daytime, but we're actually providing power to the batteries. They're storing it, and then in the off hours, they're actually feeding that back. So now we're getting different groups that actually have to interact in regard to what is this going to look like in the future. And of course, some of the challenges that come with that. You've got consultants, and of course, this is no different than any other project. You've got engineering design consultants and contractors, and you've got the distribution system, electrical people come in, you've got the electrical regulators, which of course, we in the water business don't have to deal with typically, so we don't have those kind of things. We've got the vendors for the solar panels, the battery system, the electrical switchgear, the control system. So all these people are over here working, building this system where it's basically just, to us, supposed to be another utility, right? I mean, it's basically going to provide some power to us, and it's no different than if it was coming from the grid, right? I mean, why would they depend on us to do anything? Well, as it turns out, it's interesting, I'm going to share with you, and these reference note opinions expressed are those of the presenter and not EPCOR Water, okay? So I'm opening up some of my playbook, and I'm going to share with you sort of project memoirs, things that, you know, maybe at the end of this you'll all say, well, Mark, you should have known that. And maybe that's the case, but some of these things maybe are forgotten. And I'm hoping, if nothing else, you'll look at this from a perspective of saying these are items that as you go into a project like this, you just need to be aware of. And the old saying, don't assume anything, right? And from that perspective. So the first one I found was the strong OT systems expertise is critical. I guess the challenges we had, the consultant and vendors interface with each other on the network elements, while they were really good on, like the battery guys are really good, and the solar panel guys are really good, and the people doing the electricity side were really good, their talking and the way they put things in didn't really work well together, right? And so basically as the customer who's actually looking at this, you're looking at this saying, well guys, if you do this and you do this, those things aren't going to work well together, right? And they look at each other and said, well, yeah, okay, and then we'll talk, you know, as a customer, you're saying, is that really my job? Well, no, but do I care? Yes, I do, right? From a perspective of making sure that this works. So the need to see the big picture and actually prompt them on some of these things. We had a real desire to keep the solar and the water plants network separate. We weren't trying to bring these together. Again, this was going to be more of a utility for us. I didn't need solar to produce water, right? And in the future, that may differ. And as I listened to the session this morning where we talked about some of the way utilities are being looked at, and we're all being looked at in the future, probably isn't going to be an option. You're not going to be able to say, well, if the solar is not working today, we can just pull from the grid. But there is that sense of saying, you know, when it comes to actually producing water for people, I didn't need to. The lack of the water utility customer knowledge regarding electrical requirements. That was one of the things too. We heard in the last session about core competencies, and that was a core competency we didn't have. We didn't know about the NERC-CIP regulations, how big should this be, what are some of the implications, what are some of the cybersecurity implications that we might need to look at from a perspective if we actually had to do it. And basically, we had one of the contractors on the project actually come onto site, took the whole network down during the commissioning phase because, again, they were trying to do something where they didn't see the big picture. And I actually had my team having to go out and actually get the system running again, which, of course, you know, we weren't supposed to have to do that. We were going to be over here, and it wasn't going to be part of our picture that we needed to worry about, but that wasn't the case, okay? So I guess as a reference note, I just said, you know, have strong, what I'm calling, you know, OT information systems expertise being available during the development and the commissioning of a project. It's something that I didn't expect we would need to do. I didn't expect to have to dedicate one person almost on my team to help with the project to actually go through and understand some of these things and make sure that some of these things are right. And I guess in a sense, as we talk about it, we all recognize the shortage of of people that are out there, right? There's a shortage of people. And as you're getting consultants in and then vetting those people as to who you're actually getting, understanding what you're actually going to have on your team, on your project team, is something that I'll do in the future to make sure that we understand who's who in the zoo and what their role and experience really is. So that's my first one to share with you. The next one is basically definition of remote support. Of course, we were being told that these are packaged systems that you guys don't support. We support remotely, especially during the warranty period. So they're going to come in and they're saying that they're responsible for doing this. We're not supposed to touch the systems during this period of time. And of course, they wanted to connect from anywhere. And of course, with the action of people being at home after COVID and everything else, there's lots of different places. But we needed to support the corporate IS requirements, 2FA, define static IP address, or at least a range of addresses, VPNs and stuff. And the interesting thing through all of this discussion, of course, is we had the people up front identified as some of the support people that would require remote support. And being in Edmonton, of course, remote can mean you're getting it from quite a distance sometimes when you come to your support agreements. But the interesting thing we found is that there was vendors who didn't know that they would need access, okay? And so we assumed up front, which was a good assumption. One of the things we did right was to assume that anybody who's working on this project who has a control system on it is probably going to need some level of support, because we had people at the last minute coming in and said, we didn't need support, we didn't think we needed support, we need support, oh, by the way, tomorrow, please, right? And so looking at trying to get it through your organization and trying to get through my IT organization, approvals for someone to actually remotely access is significant, and it's not something you can do in a day. So working at it. So again, a suggestion and a learning for us that I put in my project memoirs is basically assume remote access will be required, all parties involved, and working through it if you're not taking it over directly. So. Definition of support activities as well. This was an interesting one as we worked through with the solar system hardware and HMI. Sort of the standard package software is obviously different than water plant systems. So right now we're using GI Fix as our HMI. We have Modicon and Allen Bradley PLCs as basically part of our SCADA systems, depending on which plant you're in. But basically, we're transitioning to Ignition. And so one of the software packages that's going to be a part of the solar is actually Ignition-based, which is great for our team. We understand it. But the other one is basically another vendor that we're basically not supported at this point in time. And so, again, in the discussions with them and providing support and the support agreements, the question came up, so I guess you guys are supporting this remotely for us now, right? We're not involved. You're going to be doing this for us. So when are you guys, we're just curious, when are backups going to be done? How are they going to be stored? Like, all of those things that when the ISAT, the auditors come in to audit us against our NIST 882 standard, all the questions they're going to ask us are going to have to be asked these people as well, right? And so basically we're saying, we can't answer for you what kind of security policies you have in place or what you're doing. We need to know what they are. And I guess I was a little surprised at how hard that was to get from them initially, okay, in the discussion. And so, just questions like, so system upgrades and patching, okay, how's that going to be done? How are you going to maintain that? Some of those questions. The management of change process for vendors during the warranty and support period. I guess their role and support required really to review how everyone is involved and how they're doing. So it's, again, we saw a bit of well, we're the battery guys and this is the way we do it. Yeah, but you realize if you do it that way, you're going to screw up the way the solar panels are actually being interconnected in their systems at the same time. And so how are we going to manage some of those things? So again, from my experience going through this, some vendors may need some coaching as we go through this and looking at opportunities for how we can actually implement this in a way that is sustainable and in a different way than we talked about it earlier this morning. Certainly on the cybersecurity protection side, this was interesting. The challenges, again, not being familiar with the electricity side and sort of what they use for malware protection and stuff. Malware protection is not new. Basically, when I talked to, especially a lot of their electrical people over there, it was like, yeah, you guys are running, okay, yeah, that's good. What are you guys doing? Well, we do different things. And the vendor response is like, we'll do whatever the customer wants. And I'm sort of saying, well, that's nice, I guess, on the one hand, but I kind of like to know, like, when you put in the other solar panels and the other battery systems with other customers, what have you done there? Like, what have you used? What do you know works with your systems? Our regional sites, when we put in our cybersecurity monitoring from Edmonton basically out to the sites, we got blamed for loading down their networks, and that's why their networks are running so slow now. They were running slow long before we put our cybersecurity monitoring on their systems, but we got blamed for it and got, the thing. So again, we're looking at the perspective of saying, what does that look like? Again, for you, we don't want to be in a situation where things aren't working and there's a sense of our cybersecurity monitoring is the reason for that. So again, I guess what I would talk to vendors, and I really would ask as a customer, at least I would appreciate, if you're divine and provide options. Like, so when it comes to things like malware protection, those kind of things, to sort of say, well, we'll do whatever you want. I'd really like to know, what do you do? What have you done elsewhere? And what does that look like? Because that really helps in actually implementing things. And again, it's one of those areas of competencies, as we talked about this morning, that would be nice to have. When it comes to monitoring, the challenges, again, we desire to monitor the systems. We want to keep it initially separate from the Cybersecurity Center. That's not the way it's happening. We're actually going to be monitoring the system now. I mean, our existing OT monitoring, we're using Nozomi and SCADAfence, QRadar as our SIM, and Rapid7 to pull information off of Microsoft boxes. Especially during the warranty and the initial startup phases, we wanted to be careful about what, again, as I mentioned, what we were putting on their system, because we didn't want to be the guys, well, your solar system isn't working, it's because you guys went and put this security stuff on, right, and et cetera, et cetera. So, working through the issues related to that have been interesting from a perspective of going forward. And so again, on this one, I guess that customers, at least this one, would appreciate if vendors, you're to define and provide options again. So, if we were going to say, remote monitoring could be provided for this system. It's a standalone system. It's a plant that's sitting over here. You're just pulling power from it. You're not doing any control or anything special on it. You could actually get cybersecurity from any of the organizations you have here at a certain thing, and it's been set up already, and here's the keys. Like, you don't have to build it yourself, or you don't have to tell us what you want to build. So from that perspective, I guess those are some of the top ones, again, that we learned through the project. Again, just sharing with you some things that, maybe in retrospect, it's things we should have known, okay? But on hindsight, it's things we're going to ask and we'll get involved with more next time. So, and if there's a link here, if you're interested in any of the solar farm information. So, thank you.
Well, thank you, Larry. My talk is going to be a little bit different than some of the others I've heard. So let me start off, if you don't mind, with a question. By show of hands, how many of you have experienced a cyber attack on your industrial control systems in your organization? I see one hand, two, okay. And then the second question is, of those, how many of you have publicly reported the details of those attacks? I see fewer hands going up. And so the question then is, why or why not? Do one of you want to comment why you didn't make public disclosure details of what the attack was about? Go ahead. And either one? Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I don't have to.
What?
I don't have to.
You don't have to, exactly. So there's typically three reasons I talk to people about. Actually, that's actually reason 4. The first thing the lawyers say is, say nothing. The other reasons is you don't want to possibly harm your reputation by having people realize that somehow you were subject to attack. Number 2, you don't want to encourage copycats. Say, well, this looks like an easy place to go. And thirdly, you don't want to have to deal with lawsuits that often drag on for years afterward. Now, the reason I bring that up is, of course, how do we learn? Well, we hear about attacks, not too many of them. Some of the big ones we hear in the news, such as the Turkish pipeline, the German steel mill. There was a bit more detail about the Ukrainian power, I attended some briefings on that, the Florida water treatment facility and such. And of course, some of the ones that got a lot of news coverage, like the Colonial Pipeline, it really wasn't an attack on the OT system as far as everything I know. It just was a kind of, I call it a collateral damage, if you will, to a ransomware attack on the central system. So what I'm going to do for a few minutes here is raise a few things, I'll call them myths. Now, myths means things that many people, maybe not the people in the audience here today, but many people kind of take for granted that I question, if you will. The first one is, how many people have heard the saying in the newspapers, the bad guys have the advantage because they only need to find one unlocked door? How many people have heard that somewhere or other, okay, in the press? Okay? And there is some element of truth to it. I actually say that sometime when I'm in an audience, just want to kind of get rolling. But I think the opposite is actually true. Because as we'll see, and I'll talk about some examples, in order to really succeed with a cyber attack, they don't have to find one unlocked door, they have to find a bunch of unlocked doors and very specific unlocked doors, which is a lot more work. It's nowhere near as easy as it sounds, if you will. I'll give you some examples of that. The other things you'll often see in the headlines is, this should not have happened. Or a variation on that, it was a complete surprise. Well, I have two separate points here. One, if that was not supposed to happen, what had they done, if you will, to make sure it never did happen? Okay. Secondly, if the issue regarding complete surprise, we had no warning. For example, in the Colonial Pipeline, I don't know how many people watched the episode of his testimony in front of Congress. I believe he said something to the effect, oh, we had never considered the possibility that anybody ever wanted to do a ransomware attack on us. Now, is it he had never heard of the existence of ransomware? Has he been hiding under a rock for the last decade or two? But the point is, well, that would never happen to us. So in other words, there were evidence, warning signs out there in the wild, but they just were not paid attention to. We're going to argue that most cyber attacks succeed due to lack of control. And like the preceding speaker said something very important I want to highlight also. In our research, we find most cyber attacks occur when there is a change. You've had 40 years of experience with this or that. You've had an hour and a half experience with this new thing you've just installed. And that 40 years of other experience doesn't help you a lot. So a lot of these surprises occur because you hadn't considered what kinds of things could happen with the new things. So I'm going to briefly talk about something we've been developing in my group at MIT that we call cyber safety. It's basically a method for analyzing incidents and understanding in what way the controls behaved the way they did. If you think about it, whenever something is reported, and there aren't that many things reported, you'll hear quite a bit about the what happened. Our plant was shut down, or something potentially dangerous happened. You hear maybe a teeny-weeny bit about how it happened. Well, there was a defective XYZ, or someone clicked on something they shouldn't. But very little what I call about the why. What were the circumstances that made that all possible? Almost nothing goes into that. So I'm going to share with you some of our research going behind the scenes. And we discovered lots of things in many studies we have done. The cyber safety method involves a variety of things. I'm not going to go through the details and bore you about them, but I do want to talk about these steps here about building a safety control structure. What I mean by that, and many of you, of course, have engineering backgrounds, so maybe this is something you'll all appreciate, if you will. In our view, everything that goes on in your organization is a process. Of course, the process could be mechanical, could be electronic, could be computerized, or it could be human. And in general, for every process that you have, there is some kind of controller that controls the process, monitors the process, and makes sure it's doing the right things. And of course, if you think about it, that controller is a process also, whether it be mechanical or human or electronic. And so there is a controller for the controller, et cetera, et cetera. And that leads to a hierarchy of controls in the organization, from very detailed level things that are being controlled to some wider, broad-ranging things that are being controlled. I'm now sharing with you a third myth. And once again, you may see this in headlines in the reports you may have seen. Most reports focus on a single or often a very few faults that led to a cyber attack. Let me share with one that you may have heard of at the time. This happened about 4 or 5 years ago. Equifax was a credit reporting agency. They suffered a cyber attack that affected 143 million US and Canadian customers, probably many of you here. The headline pointed out that criminals exploited a US website application vulnerability to gain access. And that's the report that came out of the Equifax people. So what it sounds like, if you think about it, the takeaway is, well, we made a simple mistake. The example I used, we forgot to lock the back door. None of us are perfect. It was a minor mistake. We've locked the back door. Everything is hunky-dory now. And that's the way most stories end. They identify, that Dan over there clicked on something he shouldn't have clicked on. We slapped his wrist. He's never going to do that again. Problem solved. That's what you'll see in the press. So let me go on to talk about what we've learned. By the way, this is the CEO of Equifax testifying to Congress. I have similar, I didn't have the video of it, of the CEO of a Colonial Pipeline testifying, commenting how he never considered the possibility of it. So this is the Equifax hierarchical control structure. So it is not obviously an OT system, but the things I'm going to point out, I want you to think about the things I'm going to point out, and almost all of them, I think, probably apply to many of your own systems. This is a very detailed diagram. I'm not going to go through it, but the thing I do want to highlight here, we identified not one, not two, but 19 control failures. 19 places where things, quote, should not have happened, but were allowed to happen. And I'm going to go through them briefly just by kind of grouping them into 4 areas. I'm not going to cover all 19 of them, but see if any of these things sound familiar to things that might or could happen in your organization. Let me start off here very much at the bottom of the picture, if you will. One of the things they did, and I'm sure many of you have various types of monitoring facilities, firewalls and so on. Basically, they called it their intrusion detection and prevention system. It monitored all traffic going in and out of their systems to make sure nothing suspicious or bad was happening. Sound like a good idea to do? I'm sure many of you have things like that in your organization. But it turns out, this is a picture of it here, it's monitoring the traffic, but in order to get access to the traffic, it had to have an SSL certificate. Not uncommon with firewalls and such. But there was one minor detail. The certificate had expired 9 months earlier. Now, I don't know how many of you deal with this on a one-on-one basis. At MIT, my MIT certificate expires on July 31st each year. I got to remember, or I get a warning message, to renew it each year, probably sometime in the middle of July. And if you're a small company or an individual, it's something you kind of have to keep track of. But you're a large organization. I think they have 5,000 people in their IT department with several hundred, if not several thousand certificates, because they have hundreds of systems interacting with each other. You know, keeping track of which certificates have to be renewed on what basis is not exactly something easy to do. So basically, that thing at the bottom called a traffic analyzer was a brick sitting there doing nothing for 9 months while the cyber attack was going on. Now, you say, well, gee whiz, remember I said before, oops. Well, first thing, if you go to any website today and ask about SSL certificates, says one thing we recommend if you're a large organization is you have some kind of centralized management facility to keep track of the thousands of certificates you have, to make sure you know which ones need to be renewed and when they need to be renewed. Furthermore, even within Equifax itself, various people in the department had said, by the way, guys, we know this is very error prone. We know occasionally we slip up. We should put in a system to help us. And they said, sounds like a good idea. We'll think about it next year, because that's obviously not something we need to worry about right now. So that's the first level. The next one here, and once again, you are operating in different industries, water, electricity, and so on. You all have industry standards for doing things. This is a little different. This is credit reporting, but there is something called, let's see, you get up here now. Okay. Well, think at the bottom, you see ACES is the automated customer interview system. If you have a complaint, this is how you interact with them. You file your complaint. You give everything, your name, your address, your firstborn child, your shoe size, everything you give to the system there. In the industry, there is something here called PCI DSS. Some of you may have heard of it. It's called the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, just like there are water industry standards and electric industry standards. And basically it says, what are the things you should do to adequately protect the information and so on. And each year there is an audit done to investigate to see how well you comply with those standards. That ACS system was not included in the audit. It did accept credit card numbers. By definition, it should be included in the audit. Well, one of the reasons it may not have been included was when you actually audited afterward, they found it failed all 12 PCI DSS requirements. So one way to solve it is say, it's not required to be PCI audited, so don't even look at it. And that way you don't have to worry about dealing with a report that tells you that you failed 12 different times on that audit. Okay, let's go on now. Okay. And of course, you know, they knew it, not that it's a secret to them, they know it handled credit cards, they know it should be audited, they just chose not to audit it. Okay. Oh, the other issue, the one thing I did mention in the news report, it talked about the failure of that system because there was a known vulnerability that had been reported, I believe, 2 years earlier in the software, and it should have been patched. They never got around to it. And of course, the other thing the organization, in various internal reports, highlighted that they were doing a very poor job of patching vulnerable software. So it wasn't a secret. No, not that everybody in the organization know, but many people in the organization know that this is something we're doing that really is very risky, and nobody paid attention to it. I'll just do one more. I don't want to take too much of your time. This was kind of interesting. I call these more management failures. Let me go for a couple of them here, if you will. So one of the reasons why they postponed or didn't do certain things, this ACS system mentioned, was going to be replaced. They had plans for a new improved version. And the new improved version would have lots of things in it that possibly would have mitigated those risks. Of course, this new improved version had been deferred for 2 years so far and was still being deferred in the future. So basically it's like saying, well, the back door is wide open, but we're going to replace the kitchen eventually, so let's not worry about the back door being wide open. Okay? Think about the logic behind that. Let's see what else, okay? As I mentioned before, PCI, this is a fun question. PCI DSS, I mentioned, is an industry standard, but it's not required by any law. Actually, it turns out I think Nevada does require it, but in general, it's not a legal standard or legal requirement, it's just a recommendation by the industry. But think about it. The industry partners, in this case here, credit card partners, the ones who process your credit card, they can tell whether you're doing all the things, or at least some of the things, according to the standard. So Visa and MasterCard and so on realized that they were not doing things according to the standard. They could have said, we're going to shut you down. We're not going to take any of your credit card payments. They didn't. Why didn't they shut them down? Anybody want to speculate? Anybody? Sid. They didn't want to lose the business. These are the customers. This is a classic issue. And once again, it covers every industry. A lot of times the auditors, whether it be accounting auditors, if you will, or often are being paid for by you. And I heard of many companies, they shop for auditors, if you will. That this auditor is very tough, and they're going to find all kinds of troubles for us. Let's go to this auditor. He's very sloppy, same price or even cheaper, and he won't give us a hard time. So we have a lot of cases where we have dysfunctional activities going on out there. And then finally, even within the company, at various points in time, these things, remember, most of these things were not secrets. Most things had risen up, maybe only one part of the company, maybe only certain parts of it. There are many cases where they actually had an audit committee as part of the board of directors. They had a technology committee and board of directors. Neither one of them was responsible for cybersecurity. Now, it doesn't mean they weren't kind of vaguely aware of it, but neither one had it. In other words, by having those two committees, they allowed a gap to form when nobody was responsible for it. And just to give you an idea of the consequences, in this particular case, it only cost them $1.3 billion, equal to more than 1/3 of the total revenue, not profits, equal to 1/3 of the total revenue of the company just disappeared. Now, not right away. Some of it had to do with replacing the systems. Some had to do with various government agencies finding them. Some having to do, I think, a $100 million class action suit by the 130 million of you who basically, you get $5 and the lawyers get all the money. So basically, when you added it all up, the cost of the company was over $1.3 billion. Finally, now once again, I realize I don't want to ask a show of hands how many of you are members of the board of directors of your company or not. Probably not too many of you. But I want to give you an idea because a lot of times we focus down on the nitty-gritty and don't really see, as I think our previous speaker mentioned, the big picture of how things fit together. So it's very important that the board understands enterprise-wide risk. They need to understand the legal implications. I don't know how many of you are familiar with recent SEC regulations that now is holding boards of directors personally liable for security failures of their organization. Okay? So in other words, the bullet is coming really at the top executives in your company because, as one executive said, that's the only way to get the others to wake up. They hit them over the head with a 2x4 in some cases. Here's a question I want you may want to think about and look at. This happens to be, not this, in the past, this was voluntary. The SEC regulations are now going to make this mandatory. So for each of the member of the board of directors, you have to indicate what are their technical or what are their expertise levels. I want you to notice right here on the Equifax board, the level that was least experienced on the board of directors was cybersecurity. Okay. holding cocktail parties and other things are very high on the list of capabilities of the board of directors. So these are the kinds of things that need to go into the organization. So finally, wrap up. First thing, I don't want your company to be the next case study, unless you want to volunteer it. I appreciate that if you can. Learning from these things, as the previous person talked about, kind of what you saw as concerns, but these are even worse. These are what actually happened. I've learned time and time again, no matter how much you anticipate what can happen, the reality is always much bigger, much messier than anything you could ever imagine. Okay? So that's why you really need to learn from these things. This particular approach, not the only approach, but the cyber safety approach makes you ask you, for all those things that should not happen, what have you done to ensure they do not happen? Because almost always we hear that phrase, it should not have happened, but you then realize that nobody bothered to worry about how to make sure it didn't happen or try to make sure about it. And it's very much important to go beyond just blaming it for Dan clicking on the wrong link or something. There's usually, we've looked at about 6 different cyber attacks in quite a bit of depth. They're hard to get. Usually only the ones that actually have to go to court and all the documents, tens of thousands of documents can reveal, do you really know what really happened? But almost every time that we actually had a chance to go into them, the actual situation was not usually a single failure, it was multiple failure, and usually ranged in the dozens. In this case, it was 19 failures we discovered. So I want to thank you all. If anybody's interested, let me go back here again. Here we go. Okay. If you're interested, there was a report we have that goes into great detail. There was a short article in the Wall Street Journal. In that article, I came up with an interesting new phrase I used, which I call semi-conscious decision-making. What I mean by that is a decision made like we will postpone this to next year. So a decision was made, but no one said, okay, what are the possible consequences of that decision? So they looked at one half, the benefit of making that decision, but never looked at what risk or cost that decision might make. We've got to move away from that and really analyze our decisions and make sure we understand the consequences. Thank you all.
Hello. I'm Mike White. I am the Manager of Operational Technology Infrastructure at Orlando Utilities Commission. We call ourselves OUC. We are the, where's the little clicker thing? Okay, good. First off, I want to say welcome to Orlando. Hope everybody's enjoying the weather. I know a lot of people from up north. It's pretty nice down here for you guys. I hear it's cold in other places. OUC is a municipally owned public utility providing water and electric service to approximately 275,000 customers with over 400,000 unique service connections. We do power and water for the city of Orlando. Technically, right now, you're not in Orlando, you're in Orange County. So you get Orange County Water, and I think it's Duke Power. They're the big dog on the block around here. We were established in 1923. Our motto is we are the reliable one because we have the best reliability numbers in the state. We're the second largest municipality in Florida and is fully committed to providing world-class customer service and energy and water innovation. One of the things OUC noticed when we got our new CEO 5 years back, we started to notice, and I promise you, I made these slides last week. I know it's going to look like I copied other people's slides. We started to notice a lot of security breaches in the news, and to piggyback off what he says, there's probably way more. That's the tip of the iceberg. There's way more you don't hear about. Marriott, Twitter, Yahoo, LinkedIn, all the big companies. These are massive tech companies, and they all get security breaches. Ashley Madison, for anybody that had any of that. Another thing that we noticed was ICS breaches, and those are even less talked about than the big public companies. And with that, one of the things we noticed about the ICS breaches is it's no more war games with some person with a modem dialing in, one kid just messing around. Now these are groups of people. There's a lot of them. They're very smart, and they are state-sponsored in a lot of cases. You know, the Ukrainian Black Energy one scared probably every power company in North America, I would say. That's one that really got everybody noticing and wanting to change things. So when they said they wanted this to be a top-level view, I thought they meant from me being at the bottom looking up to the top. So we are definitely a medium to smallish size municipality. We're not as big as the city of Atlanta. We're not as small as the city of Claremont, like where I'm from out west from here. Oh, sorry. One of our main concerns when we were looking at our OT cybersecurity was staffing. You know, we had a core staff of some network guys, we had some system guys, and we had a network security guy that, you know, that was around. So we were kind of staffed somewhat for changes to be made in our industry. But with a lower sized municipality, one of the main things that we run into is we have lower budgets than, you know, a LinkedIn or a big power company like Duke or FPL. We have lower budgets. We have less positions available to do work. Like all my guys have to wear many different hats. My network guy has to do security. My systems guy has to do security on his side and applications on his side. So one of the main problems I found, and I will definitely touch on it later, is I had, you know, we sometimes small municipalities become farm systems for some of these bigger companies. You know, they take our linemen, they take our infrastructure people, so we have to always be looking for that. But at the same time, you know, us and Duke, we all have the same threats. Us, Duke, FPL, we all have the exact same threats to deal with. It's not just we're smaller, we're less of a target. And then also, because we are a generation facility and a transmission operator, we have to take NERC into account with almost every decision we make when it comes to the power side. So when we started looking at companies and started looking at what we could do to improve our cybersecurity posture, one of the things that we looked at was what new technologies were out there, you know, besides what we were already doing. We were already doing your basic standard stuff. We were doing your zero trust. We were doing nano segmentation. We got endpoint security. We're whitelisting. We're geo-blocking. We're doing all those. So we were looking for something that could augment that. You know, you can always go out and get another antivirus or something like that. We have, you know, IPSs and stuff like that. We were looking for something different. And also, going back to our budget, we were looking for where we can get the most bang for our buck. Where could we spend our money and then actually get something really good out of it? And do I have the talent to manage it after it's installed, right? Because you're only going to get out of a tool what you put into the tool. And then obviously, you know, the number one thing, how effective is it? You know, are you really giving me something that I can use, some actionable stuff? And also, is it proactive or reactive, right? Everybody says they want to be proactive, but you still can't forget about reactive. You got to be able to resolve a problem if it gets in, right? Because not everybody is going to be, you're not going to stop everything. If something gets in, you got to be able to react to it and squish it. All right, so our decision. You know, we interviewed multiple vendors. We looked at a lot of things. We came through, basically, we looked at the effectiveness, the augment, how long would it take to get it installed? I don't know if you've worked with a municipality, but we are slower than turtles. We do not implement anything really fast. I'm not sure if you've been out to a power plant. They do not like changes. They don't like you messing with stuff out there. So we looked at that. We looked at training time, and then once again, you know, proactive, reactive. And then also we have to take that into account, the user experience. Is it something that we can use? You know, is it going to give me, you know, what I need? So we chose to go with a passive monitoring and SOC solution that was really able to augment what we were doing. Like I said, we've already done the zero trust, we did all that, the micro segmentation. What else was there we could do to get more eyes in more places where, let's be honest, when you're smaller like us, you can't see everything. You got to have help. That's the number one thing. You can't do it with just your small team that you got there. We found out when we went with this solution, and I'll just go ahead and say it, we went with the Dragos monitoring solution with the SOC. You know, that's The installation was simple. It was straightforward. Time was a challenge sometimes because, people don't just like to walk over there and turn the generator off. You got to wait for an outage, and that sometimes, that those generators can run for 6 months before you even get a chance to do anything. They don't want you messing with nothing. So I was able to work around that. They offered training for us. The solution is both proactive and reactive. We were able to, there's a lot of threat hunts that they go on for us, and we're also able to go, when they find something, we're able to go do it. Because like I said, we can't have eyes everywhere. I can't. It's nice to have somebody else also looking at the problems that we have. Let's see. Now we have a roadmap to see where we want to go and how to get there. We've started with we implemented in phases. Because we started with the first main phase to get a lot of ingress and egress traffic, and now we're going farther and farther down the line to get more data there. We have used other services provided. There's a lot of other services that they can come in because everybody talks about assessments. I'm not sure if people are like those or whatever. A good security assessment, we get them from our NERC vendors, we get them from, security vendors. It's good to have somebody come in and go, that's not right. That there's a problem here that you've been missing. And yes, we have had some of those times where it's like, we're going to fix it next year. Yeah, we got that on the thing. But at least we say, we'll patch it now while we're in transition. So yeah. I get nervous and talk too fast, but yeah, we now have eyes in a lot of places where we didn't have eyes before, and that can help you sleep at night, because when you're a power company, one of the, you get that black energy for Ukraine was very scary for power companies because the worst thing you can have is your operators being fed bad data. You don't want your operators getting bad data because they're going to make decisions based off the data they see, and if it's bad, it can cause a lot of problems for you. So, thank you.
Again, I encourage you to ask questions. No such thing as a dumb question here. Like I said yesterday, this is not an opportunity you get every day to actually talk to people like this in an open forum and ask them anything you want, within reason, of course. And I'll give Dan just a couple of minutes to explain who you are and where you're from and what you do and so forth. So.
Yeah, thanks, Larry. So Dan Scally, Senior Director of Strategy at Dragos. We are an OT cybersecurity company. That's all we do. We don't focus on the IT side. As Mike mentioned, we have a technology that essentially can be deployed on an industrial network to show you, what you have, to show you what the vulnerabilities might be, if you have any threats or compromise in the environment, and then most importantly, what to do about it. So we do kind of lead with our technology solution. We also have, as Mike mentioned, some threat intelligence capabilities where we're studying and understanding where the attacks are and how they work so that we can better defend against them and also help customers along the way with their journey with some of our professional services to check in on what's going on in the technology and maybe do assessments or other things to help customers along the way. So that's just a brief description of kind of who I am and who Dragos is and our business.
Thanks, Dan. We have Sid Snitkin walking around with a. Do you have a microphone, Sid? Yeah, we have a microphone. Do we have a question to start off? Great.
Yeah, Dan from Dow. Mark, you mentioned something very specific that's near and dear to my heart. You mentioned that you test your disconnect from the corporate networks on a regular basis. Is this an operating discipline that you do regularly? And if so, do operators also understand if and when they should do it? Or is it an automated process to actually keep up with the speed of cyber? Because by the time I call a plant operator and go tell them to pull a cord, game's over.
Well, first off, it's my team that pulls the cord, but we have to tell the operators we're going to do it. So it is one of those scheduled events that we talk to and basically have an opportunity to work with it. It is something that we do. It's a part of, it's actually the board of directors that actually came down from EPCOR. And you know, as I mentioned on Monday at my presentation, you know, the good old days was when they didn't know who the OT guy was, right? And now so often I'm called up to the board of directors to answer questions about, you know, can what happened in the Florida plant actually happen in our water plants, et cetera, right? So those kind of things. So we've included this as something just as a test. It's interesting because one of the things, we did it once, and actually, of course, it depends on how long you do it for. So the first time we did it, we just did it for a period of time to prove that, yeah, the control systems operated. We asked the operators in the control room, did you see any difference? Like, here are things that could have been a problem for you. You know, were you doing changes in the plant? So we let them run for a while without it, and there was no problem. I know on the electricity side of the organization, they're much more tightly integrated with IT, and they weren't in the same position to be able to do what we were able to do on the water side, so we're a little bit different from that perspective. I guess the other part of it was basically we did, interestingly enough, have someone decided they were going to try to pull some copper out of some pipes. And then, of course, they cut the pipe and discovered it was actually a fiber and not a copper, so they didn't actually get what they were after. But they did cut out the network to one of our plants, and it was interesting in the plant discussion because one of the things people couldn't get to was that basically standard operating procedures. You know, all those things, we're an ISO-certified plant, so basically ISO certification, and so, of course, you don't want to have any documents lying around that are paper, right? Because as soon as your auditors come in, first thing they go is looking for paper documents, and oh, this paper document isn't up to date, and there's a non-conformance, right? So, of course, everything's online, and, of course, one of the things that the team didn't realize was, gosh, if you lose a connection, if we ever needed to get a standard operating procedure, those are some of the things that we need to do. So now we're in our DMZ, we're actually putting a system in to actually, you know, copy down all the standard operating procedures on a regular basis, keep them up to date there. Normally, yeah, if you come in and audit, no, we don't use those, we're using the corporate systems and stuff. But in the event of an incident like this where you can't get to those procedures, you don't have to send the operations manager home with a stick to go get the procedures so he can bring them back in, right? So.
If I could maybe just add an interesting point to that. One of the things that we observed during COVID was, you know, a lot of the board level conversations are typically, oh, don't worry, it's air gapped, right? Or there's, you know, not connectivity or things like that. And then, you know, even at kind of the very highest non-technical level during COVID, when there was remote operations of facilities, you know, even a non-technical person can understand, well, someone must have, you know, connectivity into that. So that was actually an interesting thing that happened over the past few years that really exposed that, no, it's not disconnected, right? Because there is different connectivity. It's surprising to me still, you know, having various executive level conversations that, you know, some of the stuff that's communicated upwards that things aren't connected.
I don't know the regulations you have to deal with, but this issue of not having anything on paper can be a problem. I at least know one case where there was a major attack, and we had a detailed contingency plan, of course, on the system that was no longer accessible. So everybody had basically reconstruct the contingency plan they had detailedly worked on 6 months earlier because nobody had access to it.
Do we have another question?
Hello. John Cusimano with Deloitte. I think my question is largely to Stuart, but welcome feedback from anybody on the panel. Stuart, really appreciate the cyber safety methodology. That's a subject that's near and dear to my heart, the integration of, or the convergence of security and safety, particularly in OT. The question I had for you, because I haven't read your, I've heard about your methodology, I haven't studied it, but I wanted to know if you're familiar with work done by the ISA, International Society of Automation, and IEC for the 62443 standard that also offers up a cyber safety methodology that is sounds fairly similar in looking at threats and vulnerabilities and consequences and actually walking through the actual system architecture.
Well, one of the things I'm not sure if I say it out loud is really important to you to have a methodology. I mean, obviously, we'd love to use ours, but the point being is most organizations have no methodology, or at least no systematic methodology. So the first thing we recommend. And I don't want to go through the history, but we developed it based upon the work that my colleague, Professor Nancy Levson at MIT in the aeronautics department did, working with the aerospace industry over about 2 decades. So this methodology, or variations on it, have been around for quite a while. They had not previously been applied to cybersecurity. They were mostly safety mechanisms. That when a safety accident happened that should not have happened. They did a detailed investigation of the Challenger space shuttle, and a lot of things that people didn't realize behind the scenes went on. So we took it and we adapted it. So there are others out there that have similar methodologies.
Is it a publicly available methodology?
Well, yes, we have a number of papers on what we did, and she called it STAMP, S-T-A-M-P. She's been writing about it for about 2 decades, so there's a whole literature of it, mostly applied to preventing or analyzing accidents.
One thing I'll also just add is, there's definitely benefit to using standards and methodology. One thing even just more simple than that we found to be very effective is just asking, what does a bad day look like for your organization, and what is it that you're trying to protect, right? And these are like fairly simple, basic questions, but really kind of going through that exercise of understanding, what the worst impacts are, and then working backwards from there can be a way to just kind of very simply understand what it is you're trying to protect, and then sort of walk through the different controls that can shut that down. So there's, I guess if you were to tie it to a methodology, there's, attack for ICS that kind of goes through and enumerates the different, types of offensive strategies that an attacker might use, and you're really just looking to make sure that, through that process of them getting an initial foothold to eventually like delivering a payload that has some sort of impact on your industrial operation, that you're trying to cut that off every step of the way and have as much coverage as possible.
I just want to elaborate a little bit on what Dan said, very important. I think many of us, and it's a real challenge, you almost have to kind of flip your thinking upside down. Most of the time we think about how things should work. We often don't think about how things could work. Well, what if someone did this? We say, well, no one would ever do that. But what if they did that? And this is something that we don't normally do. It requires a very change the way our thinking, because that's what the bad guys do. They'll do something you never anticipated.
Yeah, we're big proponents of things like cyber HAZOP, cyber PHA, risk-based analysis. The attack framework is really useful, and I know you guys have a really cool thing where you can map, TTPs of some of the major advanced persistent threat groups with, the different aspects of the attack framework. So if you're not familiar with that, I would urge you to go out and do research on all those things and talk to Stuart about, their safety-based analysis approach too. We've always felt that safety and cybersecurity are really closely intertwined. I mean, cybersecurity at the end of the day, especially when we're talking about industry and the process industries, is really, at the end of the day about safety. Do we have any other questions from the audience here? Sid, did you have a question you want to
Yeah,
ask?
I got a ton. I slept really well last night. So
All right, go. Let's go.
I'll give you a warning, but I'll let everybody else talk first.
Yeah, Mark Duck with Shell. So I've talked to John about this, this intersection between cyber and safety, and I was thinking about your safety, your cyber safety talk, but it didn't to me appear to have the intersection with actual safety. It looked like an analysis of the IT kit basically, and how this cyber attack could unfold. Now, we've been studying this for a little while, and we've decided that this year we're going to actually make a change to our LOPA process, which that's a safety analysis process we use in our risk assessment matrix. It would be for what we call our major accident hazard risk levels. There's different risk levels, and for those that are the highest risk or the high risk category, we're going to look at our safety barriers, right? So if you're not familiar with, HAZOP, basically it's an analysis of what are the hazards in your environment, safety hazards, and it's not, they don't assess consequential business loss type of incidents, like the plant gets shut down, but nothing was damaged. We're talking about harm to people, damage to assets, harm to environment, harm to community. Those are the 4 categories that we use in Shell. Now, the barriers that they pick to protect against those kinds of incidents are, valves like pressure relief valves to release pressure. In one of the big categories, they call them safety instrumented systems. Now, those are running on microprocessors, running software, and typically on the network, right? And there's a variety of other barriers they're picking these days that are essentially just like that. They're what we consider cyber vulnerable, right? So now you have that intersection of safety and cyber where now you're picking a safety barrier that is cyber vulnerable. And if all the barriers you pick to prevent some sort of incident are cyber vulnerable and the initiating events cyber vulnerable, now you've got a completely hackable situation that can cause harm to people, damage to your asset, et cetera, right? And so that when I think of cyber and safety intersection, that's what I'm thinking about. And we're actually going to update our LOPA process this year to where we're going to cause these safety teams to consider what I just described, and then they have to figure out what to do about this fully cyber, vulnerable set of barriers that they've potentially picked, right? But any additional thoughts on that? I'm always interested to hear thoughts on where that safety and cyber life cycle intersect.
Great question. Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
I would just say specific to the SIS design, I would hone in immediately on the designs where the DCS and the SIS are riding on the same network, right? Which some vendors have kind of moved to that. If you look back at a really specific example of the Trisis incident back in 2018 at a Saudi Arabian petrochemical facility, the attackers basically came in through the internet because of a network misconfiguration, were able to compromise the DCS, and then as they were trying to reprogram the SIS, it tripped and did what it was supposed to do and kind of shut the plant down. And it was only later they realized that this was a cybersecurity failure and not a safety failure, and that the attackers were actually able to kind of pivot all the way from the internet down to the SIS. So, but as you outline that example, that's one of the things that kind of popped immediately into my head of being able to kind of trace, what are the network routes, and I think similar to the COVID example that I gave, the first reaction is, oh no, you could never do that, right? Or that's the safety system, but to really get into a very detailed analysis, at the IT level, right, or at the networking level of where can you go from point A to point B.
Well, can you hold up for a sec, because we can't hear you. If you can get the microphone, we'll all be able to hear you.
So while the microphone is traveling, let me make a quick comment back to something Larry said earlier regarding Swiss cheese. One of the things you have to consider in any kind of methodology you use, if you look at a situation in isolation, you say, well, this thing could happen, but that won't cause any problem, unless this also happens. Now, in the natural world with safety, we're dealing with kind of probability. The odds of two independent events happening at the same time is pretty small, so you can kind of discount it. If you're dealing with a cyber attack, these two unlikely things could happen at the same time. So you have to be able to not just look at a single event, but look at what combination events could cause if they happen at the same time. I'm not sure if that made sense, but that's a key difference between safety caused by natural effects and a cyber attack which is deliberately planned.
Yeah, good point.
So going back on the safety, because it's interesting, I think there is some similarity what they want to do with what they have done with 61508 and what they're actually going to do with what's mentioned before, 62443. So for example, if you design according to 62443, is a lot of the same things you need to do on 61508, correct? So you need to make sure that your firmware has followed certain procedures, your documentation, the way you manufacture stuff as well. So that is actually what I think what they're trying to do with that 62443 is both from a design, but also from a deployment perspective. And I think they're taking pieces out of what they learned with 61508. Of course, it's a little bit different, but I think that's what they're trying to get also that sort of, at the end, certification or level done. Yeah, so.
Yeah, for those not familiar, 61508 is the IEC standard for safety. And it's the umbrella standard, my understanding is, and 61511 is more focused on, yeah, yeah. Any other questions? Yep, yes, sir.
Yeah, hi, Jim Montague, Control Magazine. I just was wondering if Mike and Mark could, maybe tell somebody else who wants to do the same things that they did, somebody who's not as far along the learning curve, what should be on their to-do list to begin to implement or develop and implement a cybersecurity program? What steps would you tell them to take?
And I understand Jim's a writer, an editor, so what? Allegedly. But anyhow, no, and so he likes to write articles to give advice to people, so I'm just qualifying this question.
Well, one of the things that we did first, like I said, was I looked at the staff we had. I mean, my bad, I'm sorry. We looked at what was out there. What were our threats? What was our risk of being exposed? Those are the two first things you look at, and then I looked at my staff. And that's when you go back to upper management and you ask them, if you want this, this, or this, I need this, this, and this. And if management's behind you, if like my company, the people were behind us for it, they wanted it, they made sure we had the resources to get where, to improve our posture. So, what did they want? They wanted nothing to ever happen, ever. We don't ever want a security breach ever. That's what they wanted. I said, I can't promise that, but we can get pretty close if you give me this, this, and this. I needed resources for staffing. I needed a budget. I needed a budget to bring in consultants, because if I'm not sure about other companies, but upper management never listens to lower management unless you have a consultant tell them. And it's funny, the consultant says the exact same thing lower management said. So, what did we put in place? A passive monitoring system with a SOC solution. Because
Was the SOC in-house or contracted?
the SOC is with a contracted company. We're not like a Nextera who has the budget to have their own threat people, to have their own. I was talking to a guy the other day from Nextera. He has 11 people just on his cybersecurity team. I said, I've got 4 people. I've got 4 people to do everything. So you kind of have, if you're smaller, you have to look outside. So that's what we did. Well, my network team is also the security team. So my network guys go to cybersecurity classes. A couple of them have gotten certs in cybersecurity. My system guys go to system classes. They go to CEH courses. We pay for them to do that. So everybody's getting the training. The upper management was committed to that. So that's what we've been able to do. Now that doesn't stop them from, a company like Siemens coming along and throwing a ton of money at them. So.
Thanks for that. I think we
But
have
that's
another.
just our.
Oh.
Yeah.
I guess on our front, a lot of it's been driven. We have an internal audit as an organization, and an internal audit group that goes around and audits everything in the organization, from cybersecurity to safety, especially all those kind of areas. And one of the things they came in with a number of years ago now was basically they were going to audit us, and they brought in, of course, an IT audit standard, right? So they're going to bring in IT, and they started to say, this is what we're going to audit you against. And I looked at this and said, well, this doesn't apply in my world. I mean, these standards are not applicable. And they said, so what does apply? And so basically we went back against, at the time, this is probably 10 years ago now, NIST 800 standard, 82, we were trying to use at the time the ISA standard, but it was still being underdeveloped. It was underdeveloped, it was still being developed at that point. So ISA 99, which became the 62443 IEC standard now. But so we were being driven by looking at those kind of things. But we'd always been involved in looking at what does a cybersecurity look like. I'll always remember 15 years ago when I went to my first SCADA, to be certified as a SCADA information specialist when it comes to cybersecurity. the course happened to be in Las Vegas, okay? And so here I am going to my director of asking, can I go to a course in Las Vegas, okay? Well, he had to actually escalate that to senior VP approval level before we could actually get to go to the course. And the only reason we really got to go was at the end of the week, you had to pass an exam with a 75% average to actually get certified. And of course, that was part of the requirement with me going to the course. Right? So I guess over time, we've been looking at these at different aspects. So being driven by the standards, being driven by internal audit to actually say, you know, how are you doing against the standards that are out there? But the interesting thing, I think, is we transitioned from auditors where you're auditing against the standard to say, are you doing the right things? And those are all important. That'll get you so far. But actually bringing in external groups that are going to do, we brought in a group basically that are a bunch of hackers, right? So they're going to do the things that basically somebody who's going to try to get into your system is going to happen. And it was brought in by corporate IT to start with. But it's interesting, of course, you know, I think any corporate IT guy who's responsible for security, when the guy who came in actually reaches across the table and gives him his password, which is like 12 characters long with all kinds of things, and says, here's your password, they got the attention of corporate security, right? And so we actually use the same group for ourselves. When we put in our SIM, our operational technology SIM and our monitoring center, we brought them in to do a live fire test on the SIM. And they come in and do those crazy things like, you know, they'll throw a blanket over top of your barbed wire fence and crawl over top and jump in and plug into your network to show you that, yeah, you do have a vulnerability here, right? This is possible to do it. So those are things that when you go against standards, you don't typically find that kind of stuff in standards, right? You find different things. And so we were being driven, I guess, by the internal requirements as far as standards, audits, trying to do the right things, by looking at external groups coming in, evaluating us and as to where we were in the maturity level and looking at doing the right things. And again, hoping that, you know, we listen to the folks on the electricity side who are under the NERC CIP agreements, don't want to go there. What we want to do is try to protect our systems. We want to do the right things, implement the right level of technology. I don't have a lot of staff either. I'm under the same pressures. So we don't want to just be checking boxes, but we want to say, are we making the water production for this city safe? And I guess going back to the question around, on our wastewater side, I talked about the water side, but I have a team at the wastewater plant as well where we have hydrogen, you know, H2S gas in our digesters, right? And of course, like a lot of wastewater plants, like we built down by the river a long time ago when there was no houses around the place. But of course, now it's a wonderful place and everybody's built houses around. So we have all the challenges of odor and stuff, but we also have the challenge of saying these digesters have H2S gas in them. There's a whole level of issues related to them being there as opposed to doing. So we did a process, took our process safety team and went through a HAZOP basically and did a HAZOP, took the HAZOP methodology and added to it the cybersecurity aspect to look at saying, okay, from a cybersecurity perspective, what are the things that could happen to a digester if we were hacked by somebody or if we had malware on the system and our system shut down, what would that mean? For us. And we don't have any SIS-based safety instrument system, actually. We're using Emerson Delta V as our DCS system in the wastewater plant. But we have gone through that whole process, HAZOP, and we have identified what are the highest risks within the wastewater treatment plant and what are the things that we need to be concerned about beyond just the odor, which is what the customers around us really care about. So.
I think the last couple of questions kind of raise an important area, which I think we're spending a few minutes on, and maybe some of you can contribute to. And that's the whole issue of how do small and medium enterprises deal with cyber threats. I mean, large corporations are clearly not flawless, as we know, but they have massive resources they can deploy. Obviously, one route, of course, is go to third parties like Dragos, and he'll talk a bit more about that. But I'm curious, I'm seeing some motion regarding getting the government more involved. I often use the analogy. If enemy aircraft were flying over your plants, dropping bombs on them, you'd expect the Air Force or the artillery people to try to shoot them down. If the bad guys are doing the same kind of damage to your plant, but doing it through the internet, basically you're on your own to a large extent. So there's one question is what either can or is or could the government do to help, number one. The other one, which I don't hear a lot of talk about, I don't know whether any of you are involved in it or not, but many companies have cyber insurance. And the insurance companies, for obvious reasons, are ratcheting up their requirements to you, kind of nudging you along or doing their own kind of audits. So there's a number of things that, how do small enterprises deal with these issues? Either the panel or maybe some of you could give you your experiences.
Yeah, that's a good point. Anybody have a comment on that?
I mean, I guess just maybe I'll take the government piece. one thing, at least in our experience, is one of the most important things government can do is ask industry what they need, right? And often you'll see examples, and not to be overly critical in this forum, but like something like the TSA pipeline standards, right? Were extremely prescriptive, right? To the point where, those on the ground, tasked with maintaining those systems, looked at some of those controls and said, "This is like the pipeline's not going to work anymore if we do this, right?" And so, I think that sort of collaborative approach is something that when that happens, the resulting regulatory policy and other things like that can be quite effective.
Yeah, we have a question back here.
Not a question, but a comment. First of all, going back to the comment about consultants, definition of a consultant is somebody who asks you for your watch and then tells your boss what time it is. But I just wanted to inform those in the room. My name's Eric Cosman. I co-chair the ISA 99 committee. And if you're interested in the confluence of security and cybersecurity and safety, the ISA 84 committee has a document in circulation right now. It's 300 pages long, I'm warning you, but it examines in excruciating detail the subject of safety and security. So it's out for comment as we speak. I think the comment deadline is next week.
Yeah, this is new, right?
Yeah. And so if it's something that you're passionate about, it's something you might want to look up. That's it.
Thanks. Anyone else?
No, well, I'm happy to talk if nobody else is.
Sid, yeah, ask a question.
I never
we
get a
have
chance.
somebody over
See,
here.
I never get a chance to talk.
I think it's Mark again.
Yeah, Mark Michelle again. On the government question, does anyone know? I mean, I've read some books on like cyber warfare and some of the stuff that NIS does and so forth, and it seems like they are doing something, right? Maybe the frequency of these nation-state attacks or criminal organization attacks might be higher if they weren't doing whatever they're doing. Maybe Dragos, do you have any information on what are they doing?
Well, here in the U.S., you've got DHS and CISA, and they do a ton of great work and have, over many, many years, going back, I'm sure many people in this room have participated in things like ICS-JWG, have kind of supported this community in securing control systems. So my commentary was more focused on kind of like regulatory stuff, but there's certainly a ton of resources on the government side, and no matter, I know this is also, from an international perspective, national certs typically have resources and programs and things like that. So here in the U.S., definitely would point to CISA as a place where you can go for resources.
I think I misspoke. Maybe I meant NSA, not NIS.
And not to DHS, both the FBI, the Secret Service, a lot of agencies, once again, often have overlaps, often have contradictions, are trying to bring down some of these, because a lot of times the cyber criminals are actually state-sponsored. I mean, it's often like North Korea needs money as well as attacking. So a lot of times the criminal activities also are targeted by the government officials. The trouble is it's kind of scattered and it's not very coordinated.
Yeah, one of the things I'll maybe highlight is an area where we at Dragos are working with government. So we have a program called Neighborhood Keeper. Essentially, it gives the folks that have deployed our technology the ability to opt in and anonymously share the information that is in their system in terms of the cybersecurity alerts and things like that are coming up. Now, everything stays on premise with them, which is important, but it's obfuscated and anonymized and then sent up where it can be aggregated. So, trusted third parties from governments, like DOE example was our partner in kind of setting this up, have the ability to then ask questions about the whole sector, right, or across all the deployments. So, like for example, a focus of the government a few years ago was, are there any Russian products in the electric grid? So, like the Kaspersky antivirus or something like that. And this gave them the ability to kind of essentially search for that and ask those questions. That's an example of how you could use something like this to not only see is the sector under attack, but to look and see kind of what's out there. but they don't know who it is, because a big problem for like electric utilities or other end users of opting in is, you don't want a bunch of vans rolling up to corporate headquarters, right, when something happens, and maybe it's not really a big concern, or it's not something that you have to disclose from a business perspective. So this kind of helps on both sides to kind of give everyone who participates also has access to this information. So give this sort of situational awareness and community defense, give the government agencies the ability to kind of drill into to real data about what's going on out there without having to need like actual access in to the participants' networks. And that's something that's been kind of really effective in promoting more information sharing.
Who can join that program?
Anyone.
Anyone.
It does
Okay.
require the platform, because it's the technology
Yeah.
sends
Yeah.
the information up there, but it's anyone who deploys can participate, and then the trusted advisors, which would be the government agencies, would go through an approval process.
Yeah, I'm just asking because I don't think there's enough programs like that out there. I know we have ISACs and stuff. In fact, I just applied to join the ONG ISAC as a consultant, but they tell me it's going to cost us 10 grand to do it.
And
So
ISACs
that's-
are another example
Yeah,
of a
that
trusted
could be
advisor.
a barrier. Yeah, but we need more of these forums where we can share information. I think that's really important. We got.
It's noon, Larry.
Yeah, well, we got time for one more if anybody has a question. It's 11:59 right now. If not, I will just say thanks, everybody, for presenting today. We really appreciate it. We appreciate your insight, and coming all this way to participate, and just let's give them all a round of applause.